Hello and welcome to the channel. The last lesson by Alphonse Daudet. The story is set in Alsace during the Franco-Prussian War when France lost the region to Prussia. The narrator, Little Franz, is late for school and dreads being scolded by his teacher, Mr. Hamel, especially because he has not learned his lesson on participles. On his way, he notices a crowd at the town hall but does not stop to read the news. When he reaches school, he is surprised to find an unusual silence. The villagers, including old Hauser and the former mayor, have gathered in the classroom. Mr. Hamel, dressed in his best clothes, announces that this is their last French lesson. The Prussian government has ordered that only German will be taught in schools from the next day. This news shocks Franz, making him regret not paying attention to his studies. Mr. Hamel speaks about the importance of the French language, calling it the most beautiful and logical language. He blames not only the students but also their parents and himself for neglecting education. Throughout the lesson, there is deep emotion in the classroom. Everyone listens attentively, realizing the significance of what they are losing. As the class ends, the Prussian trumpets sound outside, overcome with emotion. Mr. Hamel writes Vive la France on the blackboard. Unable to speak further, he dismisses the class with a silent gesture. This story highlights themes of patriotism, the value of education, and the pain of losing one's language and identity. Now in details. The story, The Last Lesson by Alphonse Daudet, is set in Alsace, a French district that was taken over by Prussia after the Franco-Prussian War in 1870 to 71. The story is narrated by a young schoolboy named Franz, who is not very serious about his studies. Franz's journey to school. One morning, Franz was late for school and was afraid of getting scolded because his teacher, Mr. Hamel, was going to ask questions about participles, and he had not studied. Franz was tempted to skip school and spend the day outside because the weather was nice. Birds were chirping, and Prussian soldiers were drilling in the fields. However, he gathered the courage and hurried to school. On his way, he saw a crowd in front of the town hall reading a notice. For the past 2 years, bad news about lost battles, army drafts, and orders from the Prussians had come from that bulletin board. He did not stop and rushed towards school. A blacksmith named Watcher called out to him, saying there was no need to hurry, but Franz thought he was teasing him. The unusual school atmosphere. When Franz reached school, he was surprised because it was very quiet. Normally, there was a lot of noise. The school, the sound of desks opening and closing, students repeating their lessons loudly, and Mr. Hamel's ruler hitting the table, etc. Franz had planned to use this noise as a distraction so he could slip into his seat unnoticed. But that day everything was as silent as a Sunday morning. Looking inside, Franz saw his classmates sitting quietly. Mr. Hamel was walking with his iron ruler under his arm, but instead of scolding Franz for being late, he spoke kindly and asked him to take his seat. This was surprising. Franz also noticed that Mr. Hamel was wearing his best clothes, a green coat, frilled shirt, and an embroidered silk cap, which he usually wore only on special occasions like prize giving days. Even more surprising, some village elders, old Hauser, the former mayor, and the former postmaster, were sitting at the back of the classroom. They looked sad, and old Hauser had brought an old book with him. Mr. Hamel's shocking announcement. When Mr. Hamel started speaking, he told the class, "This is the last lesson I will give you." He explained that the Prussian government had ordered that only German would be taught in the schools of Alsace and Lorraine. A new teacher would come the next day, and this was the last French lesson. Hearing this, Franz felt a shock. He had been lazy and never cared about learning French. But now he was losing his chance forever. He suddenly felt sad for not studying and regretting wasting time playing and looking for bird eggs. His books, which he once found boring and heavy, now seemed like old friends that he would miss. Even his strict teacher, Mr. Hamel, whom he used to fear, now felt like a kind person whom he would never see again. Franz now understood why the villagers were there. They had not studied when they were young and now regretted it. They came to show respect to Mr. Hamel for his 40 years of delicate service and to express their sorrow at losing their language. Mr. Hamel's emotional speech on the French language. Mr. Hamel called Franz to recite the participles, but Franz got confused and could not answer. However, instead of scolding him, Mr. Hamel said, "We all have a lot to blame ourselves for." He blamed the people of Alsace for not valuing their education and putting off learning till later. He blamed parents who preferred to send their children to work on farms or in mills to earn money instead of sending them to school. He blamed himself, saying that he had sometimes given students a holiday when he wanted to go fishing or had sent them to water his plants instead of making them study. Mr. Hamel then spoke about the importance of the French language. He said, "French is the most beautiful, clear, and logical language in the world. As long as people hold on to their language, they have the key to their freedom. When a country loses its language, it is like being enslaved." After this speech, he started teaching grammar, and French was amazed at how well he understood everything that day. Mr. Hamel explained that the lesson with more patience and clarity than ever before. The writing lesson and emotional atmosphere. After grammar, Mr. Hamel asked the students to write. He had brought new copies with the words France, Alsace beautifully written on them. These words looked like flags hanging all over the classroom. The students worked silently and seriously, realizing how precious their lessons were. Even the youngest students, who were just learning to write letters, were deeply focused. Now, no one was distracted, not even by the beetles flying around the room. Franz noticed Mr. Hamel sitting motionless, looking at everything as if he wanted to remember it forever. The desk, the garden, the trees, and even his old chair. He had been teaching in that classroom for 40 years, and now he had to leave the next day. His heart was breaking, but he continued teaching until the last moment. In the back of the room, old Hausher was trying to read from his old book, spelling out letters slowly. His voice was shaky and tears filled his eyes. The whole class felt a mix of sadness and pride. The final goodbye. Suddenly, the church clock struck 12, and the Prussian soldiers' trumpets sounded outside, marking the end of the school. Mr. Hamel stood up, pale but dignified. He tried to speak, but his voice choked with emotion. He could not finish his sentence. Instead, he took a piece of chalk and, with all his strength, wrote on the blackboard, Vive la France, which means long live France. Then, without speaking a word, he leaned his head against the wall and gestured with his hand. School is dismissed. You may go. And this is the end of the last French lesson. Theme of the story: Importance of education. People often take education for granted and realize its value only when it is taken away. Patriotism and love for one's language. The loss of the French language represents the loss of identity and freedom, regret, and lost opportunities. France, the villagers, and the Mr. Hamel all regret not valuing education earlier. Oppression and cultural loss. The story shows how the Prussians tried to erase French culture by banning the language. This story teaches us that we should never take our language, culture, and education for granted. It also reminds us that knowledge is a form of freedom that no one can take away if we hold on to it.